The house was gone. The savings account drained. 31 years of a life built side by side, and Bernard Kowalski walked out of the courthouse with a manila envelope, a duffel bag, and a dog. That was it. The dog's name was Ace, a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois with a black muzzle and amber eyes that never quite looked away from Bernard's face, as if the animal understood, on some level that no human around him seemed to, that the man was barely holding together. Bernard had served 22 years in the army. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. He'd come home with a bad knee, a hearing aid in his left ear, and a way of waking up at 3 in the morning that never quite went away. Loretta had been patient with him. He would give her that. She had been patient for a long time. But patience, he had learned, was not the same as loyalty, and when the opportunity came, the real estate developer from Phoenix, who wore pressed shirts and drove a truck with no mud on it, Loretta had chosen comfort over the man who couldn't sleep through the night. The lawyers had called it equitable distribution. Bernard called it something else, but there was no one to say it to except Ace. He drove north out of Tucson with no particular destination in mind. Ace sat in the passenger seat with his nose pressed against the cracked window, ears flat in the hot desert wind. Bernard had a half tank of gas, $400 in his wallet, and a memory of a place he hadn't thought about in years, his father's land. It sat somewhere outside a small town in northern New Mexico called Cimarron, or near it, anyway. Bernard hadn't been back since the funeral. That had been 16 years ago. His father, Albert, had been a quiet man who kept to himself on 40 acres of high country land near the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. He'd raised cattle for a while, then stopped, then started again, then gave up for good. When he died, he left the land to Bernard and nothing else, because there was nothing else. Bernard had meant to sell it. He never had. The drive took him through white sands and past the long flat stretch of highway where the wind blows sideways and the tumbleweeds don't even bother to roll, they just skid. Ace slept for a while, then woke up and put his head on Bernard's arm, and Bernard didn't push him away. He stopped once for gas and a cup of coffee that tasted like cigarette ash and didn't drink it. He stopped again outside of Santa Fe to let Ace out, and stood in the parking lot of a rest area watching the mountains in the distance, gray and close in the afternoon light. His knee ached. It always ached when rain was coming. He didn't have a plan. He knew that. 63 years old, retired, divorced, living out of a duffel bag with a dog, as his only witness to any of it. If someone had described that life to him 20 years ago, he would have laughed. Now it just felt like weather. Something you move through. The turnoff was unmarked, the way his father had always wanted it. Bernard almost missed it. He slowed the truck to a crawl and turned onto a dirt road that hadn't been graded in God knows how long. Ponderosa pines crowded both sides. The road climbed. His headlights caught the white trunks and threw long shadows behind them. The house, when it appeared at the end of the road, was smaller than he remembered. It was also in considerably worse shape. The porch had partially collapsed on the left side. The front window was intact but filmed with years of dust and spider webs. The door, when Bernard tried it, had swollen in the frame. He had to put his shoulder against it and shove twice before it gave way with a sound like something that had been holding its breath finally letting go. Inside, the air was cold and still and smelled like old wood and pine resin and mouse droppings. A propane lantern sat on the kitchen table. Bernard found matches in the same drawer where his father had always kept them. Second drawer on the left, below the coffee maker that no longer existed, and lit the lantern and held it up. The furniture was still there. The table, the 2 wooden chairs, the iron bed frame in the back room, the hooks on the wall where his father's coat and hat had hung for 40 years. Bernard set the lantern on the table and sat down in one of the chairs. Ace sniffed the perimeter of the room in careful loops, nose working along the baseboards, the corners, the gap under the back door. He came back to Bernard and sat between his boots and looked up at him. "Yeah," Bernard said. "I know." He hadn't brought much food, but he'd brought enough. He heated a can of soup on the propane stove, which, to his surprise, still worked, and ate standing up at the counter, looking out the kitchen window into the darkness. Ace ate from a collapsible bowl Bernard carried in the side pocket of his duffel. Then the dog turned 3 circles in front of the wood stove, which Bernard had managed to get going, with 2 pieces of dry birch he found under the porch overhang, and lay down with a long exhale. Bernard lay down on the iron bed with his coat over him, and listened to the pines move in the wind outside, and did not sleep for a long time. Before we go on, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. It's always good to know who's out there listening. The first week, he repaired the porch. He found tools in the lean-to shed behind the house. His father's tools, still oiled, still hanging on the pegboard where Albert Kowalski had put them 30 years ago. Bernard worked slowly because of the knee, and because there was no reason to hurry. He used wood from a stack of rough-cut lumber at the back of the shed, and when he ran out of nails, he drove into Cimarron and bought more. Nobody at the hardware store asked who he was or why he was there. He liked that about small towns. They let you be quiet. He also bought 2 bags of dog food, a better lantern, a box of long matches, and a bottle of whiskey that he put on the highest shelf of the kitchen cabinet and told himself was for emergencies. Ace, during all of this, did something that Bernard would spend a long time thinking about later. He walked the perimeter of the property every morning, not aimlessly, with intention. He'd start at the northwest corner of the lot, near the old corral fence, and work his way along the tree line in a slow, methodical circuit. Bernard watched him from the porch the first morning and assumed he was tracking deer. The second morning he watched more carefully. The dog wasn't tracking. He was returning to the same spots, in the same order, pausing at each one. On the third morning, Ace stopped at a particular place in the southwest corner of the property, about 40 yards from the house, where a stand of scrub oak grew dense and low. He stood there for a long time. Then he looked back at Bernard. Bernard walked over to him. The ground there was uneven, covered in years of leaf litter and pine needles. There was a slight depression in the earth, roughly rectangular, maybe 6 feet by 4. A rusted ring bolt was set into a timber frame just visible beneath the debris. Bernard crouched down. His knee sent a sharp complaint up his leg. He ignored it. He pulled away the leaves and pine needles and found what he was looking at. A hatch door, set flush with the ground, secured with a padlock that had long since rusted through. He pulled on the padlock and it broke open in his hand. The door was heavy. He lifted it with both hands and let it fall back against the earth and looked down into the darkness below. A wooden ladder descended into the earth. The air that rose from it was cool and dry. Bernard looked at Ace. Ace looked at Bernard. He went and got the lantern. What his father had built down there, Bernard would later try to explain to his son on the phone, and find that he could not quite get the words right. It wasn't a shelter, exactly. Or rather, it was, but it was more than that. It was the project of a man who had lived alone for 20 years and had filled his solitude with purpose. The space was roughly the size of a 2-car garage, dug into the hillside and reinforced with poured concrete walls. Wooden shelving ran the length of both long sides. There were canned goods, hundreds of them, most still sealed, the labels faded but legible. There were tools. There were hand-drawn maps of the property, folded carefully in a wax paper envelope and dated in Albert's small, precise handwriting. There was a cedar chest, locked, with a small brass key taped to its lid with a piece of masking tape. Bernard sat down on the floor of the shelter with the lantern beside him and opened the cedar chest. Inside were documents, the deed to the property, in his name, a notarized letter from his father's attorney, dated 3 years before Albert died. A smaller envelope marked Bernard, "When you're ready." He opened that one last. The letter was 2 pages, written on yellow legal paper in his father's handwriting. He read it in the cold underground room, with Ace pressed against his side, and the lantern light moving gently on the concrete walls. He didn't read it all the way through the first time. He got to the end of the first page and had to stop. His father had known the land had value. He had known it for years. A surveyor had come through in the early 1980s and told Albert that the eastern portion of the property sat above a small but meaningful aquifer, not large enough for commercial development, but large enough that it would, one day, be worth something significant to the right buyer. Albert had not sold. He had written, in his slow, careful way, "I didn't want to sell what God put there, but I also didn't want you to not know it was yours." Also in the cedar chest, a savings passbook from a credit union in Taos, with Albert's name and Bernard's name listed as co-holders. Albert had been depositing into the account for 11 years before he died. The passbook showed a balance, at the date of the last entry, of $34,000. That had been 16 years ago. Bernard sat there for a long time. Ace put his head on Bernard's thigh. Outside, Bernard could hear the wind in the pines, moving the way it moves in high country. Not gusting, just leaning, a steady pressure from the northwest that had probably been blowing since before either of them were born. He called his son, Owen, that evening from the porch. He hadn't told Owen where he was. Owen was 41 and lived in Denver with his wife and 2 kids, and he had his mother's tendency to worry in a way that expressed itself as irritation. He would be irritated when he found out Bernard had driven to New Mexico alone without telling anyone. He was, "Dad, come on. You could have told me." "I'm fine, Owen. I know you're fine. I'm saying you could have. I found something," Bernard said. The line was quiet for a moment. Bernard told him about the hatch, about the shelter, about the cedar chest and the letter and the passbook. Owen didn't say anything until Bernard finished. Then he said, "Grandpa knew about the aquifer, apparently. He never told you. He told me in the letter." Another silence. Then Owen said quietly, "That sounds like him." Bernard agreed that it did. They stayed on the phone a while longer. Owen asked if he was coming back to Tucson. Bernard said he didn't know. Owen said that was fine. Bernard could hear his grandkids in the background. Some dispute about something that required loud opinions, and Owen's wife, Nora, managing it in her calm way. "Dad," Owen said before he hung up. "Yeah, are you doing okay? I mean, actually okay." Bernard thought about the lantern light in the underground room. He thought about the letter and the handwriting he hadn't seen in 16 years. He thought about driving north out of Tucson with $400 and a dog and no plan, and ending up here. "I think so," he said, "getting there." He spent 3 more weeks on the property before anything else happened. He fixed the porch. He replaced 2 sections of fence along the eastern boundary. He repaired the lean-to roof with corrugated metal he bought in Cimarron, and found that the work, the physical insistence of it, was the only thing that made his mind quiet in a way that felt clean rather than just empty. He drove to Taos on a Tuesday and visited the credit union. The account was still active. In the years since Albert's death, the interest had accumulated. The balance was no longer $34,000. He drove back to the property and sat on the newly repaired porch for a while. Ace lay at his feet, chin on the floorboards, eyes half closed in the afternoon sun. Bernard thought about Loretta, and the man from Phoenix with the clean truck, and the courthouse, and the manila envelope. He thought about it the way you think about weather that has already passed. Not without feeling, but without the urgency of someone still standing in it. He thought about his father, alone here for 20 years, building something underground that no one knew about, depositing money into an account every month with both their names on it, writing a letter when he knew the end was coming, and putting it in a box for his son, to find whenever he was ready. He hadn't been ready at the funeral. He knew that now. He'd stood at the grave in his dress uniform and felt the cold New Mexico wind and couldn't wait to leave. He'd had a wife and a house and a life waiting back in Tucson. He hadn't understood yet that the thing he was burying was one of the last things that would hold him up without asking anything in return. He understood it now. Her name was Pamela Croft, and she showed up on a Saturday. Bernard heard the truck before he saw it, a white SUV with a Bernalillo County seal on the door, picking its way carefully up the dirt road. A woman got out, early 60s, silver hair pulled back, wearing the kind of practical boots that suggested she'd walked a lot of rough ground in her life. She carried a clipboard and a folder and did not look like someone who had gotten lost. "Mr. Kowalski?" She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm Pamela Croft. I'm with the county assessor's office. I'm sorry to come out without calling. I didn't have a number." Bernard had been splitting wood. He set the maul against the chopping block. "What can I do for you?" She explained it carefully and without rushing. The county had been aware of the potential aquifer on the eastern section of the property for some years. There was a land trust, a consortium of conservation organizations and municipal water agencies that had been quietly trying to acquire properties above this particular aquifer for the past decade. The owners of the surrounding parcels had mostly sold. His father's property had been the holdout. "We assumed the estate had been abandoned," she said. "When the assessor's office updated the tax records last month and found your name attached, we thought we should reach out." Bernard leaned against the porch rail. Ace sat beside him, watching Pamela Croft with calm professional attention. "You want to buy the land," Bernard said. "The land trust does, yes. Specifically the eastern 40%. They're not asking for the house or the surrounding acreage, just the parcel above the aquifer." She opened the folder and handed him a sheet of paper. "That's their current offer." Bernard looked at the number. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked back up at her. "And they've been trying to get this for how long?" "Since 2009, she said. Bernard folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll need to think about it." "Of course." She handed him a card with her number. "Take whatever time you need." After the white SUV had made its way back down the road and disappeared into the trees, Bernard sat on the porch steps and unfolded the paper and looked at the number again. Ace put his head under Bernard's arm. "I know," Bernard said. 2 days later his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Loretta. He let it ring. She called again 20 minutes later. He let that one ring too. The third time he answered, "Bernard." Her voice had the careful quality of someone who has rehearsed. "Loretta, I heard you were up in New Mexico." He didn't ask how she'd heard. Owen, probably, through the complicated social channels that connected everyone who had ever known each other in a mid-sized city. "I am," he said. "At your father's place." "That's right." A pause. Then, "I heard there might be some kind of deal with the county?" There it was. Bernard had wondered how long it would take. "Who told you that?" he said. "Does it matter?" Her voice shifted slightly, something trying to be warmth. "Bernard, whatever happened between us, the lawyers, all of that, I'm still—" "Loretta," he said. "Don't." Silence. "This land," he said, "has been in my family since 1961. My father bought it. My father built on it. My father spent 20 years alone on it after my mother left, and he didn't sell it to anyone. And he didn't use it to hurt anyone. And he left it to me in a letter that I should have read a long time ago." He paused. "Whatever is here is mine. My father made sure of that." The line was very quiet. "I hope you're doing well," he said. And he meant it in the distant, uncomplicated way that meant the feelings had gone still. Not angry, just resolved. "Take care of yourself." He ended the call. He sat on the porch until the sun moved behind the ridge, and the temperature dropped sharply, the way it does in high country even in late summer. One moment warm, the next reminding you that the mountains don't adjust for your comfort. Ace was at the edge of the yard, sitting at the boundary, where the mowed grass gave way to the scrub oak and pine. He had been going to that spot every evening since Bernard had fixed the fence, just sitting there, nose in the wind, looking at the trees. Bernard watched him and thought, "You found it. You found the thing that was already here, waiting." He didn't know if that was what dogs did, if the scent of something buried in the earth, something human and important, traveled up through the layers of soil and leaf litter, and found its way to an animal's nose before it found its way to the eyes of the man who should have been looking. He didn't know how any of it worked, really. He just knew that Ace had stood in that particular corner on the third morning and looked back at him, and that everything had shifted from there. He called Owen that night and told him about the offer. Owen was quiet for a long time, the way he got when he was thinking through something from multiple angles. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to accept it," Bernard said. "Part of it. The eastern parcel. Let the land trust have the aquifer. Dad would have liked that, I think. He didn't want to sell it. But a conservation trust is different from a developer." "And the rest of the property?" Bernard looked at the line of pines at the edge of the yard, dark against the darkening sky. "I'm going to stay." Another pause. Then Owen said, "Yeah, someone should be here," Bernard said. "The fence needs work, the road needs grading. The house." He stopped. "The house needs a lot of things." He could hear his son smiling. He knew what it sounded like. "Okay, Dad," Owen said. "Okay." That winter, Bernard re-chinked the log walls of the house and replaced the windows and poured a concrete floor in the lean-to shed. He got the wood stove cleaned and inspected and burned it every night from October through April. He learned the property the way his father must have learned it, slowly by foot, in all weather. He found 3 springs he hadn't known about. He found a stone wall in the woods that predated his father's ownership by at least 50 years. He found a view from the northeast corner of the property, through a gap in the pines, that looked out across the valley, all the way to the mountains beyond, and he went there most mornings with his coffee, and stood there for a while. Ace ran the property every morning, still methodical, still following his routes. Sometimes Bernard walked with him. Sometimes he just watched from the porch. Owen came in February with Nora and the 2 kids, his daughter Lily and his son Marcus. His son Pete, and they stayed for a long weekend. The kids thought the underground shelter was the best thing they'd ever seen. Pete wanted to make it a clubhouse. Lily wanted to know what the maps were of. Bernard showed them the property on the maps, showed them their grandfather's handwriting, showed them the way Albert had drawn the fence lines and the springs and the tree stands with the same careful precision he'd used on everything in his life. "He sounds cool," Pete said. "He was," Bernard said. "He was a quiet man. But he was thinking all the time." That Sunday, before Owen's family left, they walked the eastern boundary together, all of them, Ace ranging ahead through the scrub oak. The mountains were clear that morning, the kind of clarity that only comes after a week of cold. Bernard walked with his bad knee and his good hearing and his son beside him, and did not think about Loretta, or the courthouse, or the manila envelope, or any of it. He thought about his father's handwriting on yellow legal paper. "I didn't want to sell what God put there, but I also didn't want you to not know it was yours." He thought about Ace on the 3rd morning, standing in the southwest corner of the property, looking back at him. He thought about how long something can wait, buried, before the right circumstances bring it to the surface. Not just money, not just land, something harder to name. The evidence, maybe, that you were held in mind by someone who didn't say much, but kept showing up, year after year, putting something aside for the day you'd finally need it. He hadn't needed it when his father was alive. He'd had everything else. He needed it now. And it had been here the whole time, waiting in the dark for him to find his way back. That evening, after Owen's family had driven back down the dirt road, and the dust had settled in the cold air, Bernard sat on the porch with Ace beside him. The sun was going down behind the western ridge. The pines caught the last of it, that particular gold that only lasts a few minutes before everything goes blue. He didn't need much. He'd figured that out. A wood stove, and a working well, and a dog that got up every morning and walked the fence line like it was the most important job in the world. 40 acres in the high country that no one could take from him, because his father had made absolutely sure of it. He reached down and put his hand on Ace's back. The dog leaned into it without looking up the way he always did, watching the tree line in the last of the light. "Good boy," Bernard said. The mountains held the color a little longer than everything else. Then they let it go too, and the first stars came out, and the cold settled down over the land, and the 2 of them sat there in it, quiet and still, and exactly where they were supposed to be.